Somewhere right now, a government server is quietly recording encrypted dark web traffic it cannot yet read. Not because it's useless, because it's waiting. Waiting for a machine that doesn't exist yet, but one that could turn every anonymous message, every hidden transaction, every so-called untraceable identity into an open book. This is the story of Harvest Now, Decrypt Later, and why the clock on dark web anonymity may already be ticking. For more than 2 decades, the dark web has operated on a simple promise. If you route your traffic through enough layers of encryption, bouncing it across enough anonymous relays scattered around the world, nobody can trace where it came from or where it's going. That promise has a name. It's called Tor, short for the onion router, and it has been the backbone of anonymous browsing since the early 2000s. Activists and oppressive regimes have used it to communicate without fear. Journalists have used it to protect sources. Whistleblowers have used it to leak documents that governments desperately wanted buried. And yes, criminals have used it too, to buy and sell things that should never be bought or sold. But underneath all of that activity, hidden behind all those layers of encryption, sits a mathematical foundation that has quietly powered the entire system. And that foundation is not as unbreakable as most people assume. Tor's anonymity depends on a handful of cryptographic algorithms that most people have never heard of. RSA, Diffie-Hellman, elliptic curve cryptography. These systems work by relying on math problems that are, for a classical computer, essentially impossible to solve in any reasonable amount of time, factoring an enormous number into its prime components, solving a discrete logarithm across a massive numerical field. These aren't the kinds of problems you casually crack with a laptop, or even with a warehouse full of laptops. They are the kinds of problems that would take today's fastest supercomputers longer than the age of the universe to solve through brute force. That difficulty is the entire reason Tor works. It's the reason anonymity, encryption, and privacy across nearly the entire internet have held up for so long. But that difficulty was never permanent. It was only difficult for one specific kind of machine, a classical one. Quantum computers do not play by the same rules. Instead of processing information as simple ones and zeros, they use qubits, which can exist in multiple states simultaneously through a property called superposition. This allows a sufficiently powerful quantum computer to explore many possible solutions to a problem at once, rather than checking them one at a time the way a classical computer does. In the 1990s, a mathematician named Peter Shor developed an algorithm that could, in theory, factor massive numbers and solve discrete logarithm problems in a fraction of the time a classical computer would need. Shor's algorithm didn't just chip away at the security of RSA and elliptic curve cryptography, it threatened to dismantle it completely. And that includes the exact cryptographic backbone that Tor, and by extension the dark web, depends on. This is not some fringe theory whispered about in cybersecurity forums. It is one of the most well-documented and widely accepted threats in modern computer science. Governments, banks, and technology companies have known about it for years, which is why an entire field called post-quantum cryptography has emerged, dedicated to building encryption systems that can survive an attack from a quantum computer. The problem is timing. Post-quantum cryptography is still in the process of being adopted, tested, and rolled out across the internet's infrastructure, including inside Tor itself. Meanwhile, quantum computing hardware has been advancing at a pace that has caught even seasoned researchers off guard. In the spring of 2026, that pace became impossible to ignore. Researchers at Google, working alongside a quantum computing startup, published findings suggesting that quantum computers capable of breaking the encryption protocols securing the internet could arrive much sooner than experts had previously projected. The reaction from the cybersecurity community was not calm. A researcher at Cloudflare, a company that secures a significant portion of global internet traffic, described the news as a real shock. That single sentence, coming from someone whose entire job is to protect data at scale, tells you everything about how seriously this development was taken. This wasn't hype from a blog post or a clickbait headline. This was a warning from inside one of the organizations responsible for keeping the modern internet secure. So let's be precise about where things actually stand, because precision matters here more than fear. As of today, there's no quantum computer on Earth capable of breaking Tor's encryption in real time. None. IBM's Condor processor holds just over 1,100 physical qubits. Atom computing has built an array with a similar number. Google's Willow chip made headlines for operating below a critical error threshold, a major milestone, but its logical qubit count, the kind of stable, error-corrected qubits actually needed to run something like Shor's algorithm at scale, sits at only around 105. Systems built by Quantinuum and a research collaboration between Harvard, MIT, and Quira have pushed logical qubit counts into the tens, and in some cases, up toward 100. These are extraordinary achievements. They represent genuine accelerating progress. But breaking the elliptic curve cryptography used to secure systems like Bitcoin, which relies on similar mathematical principles to what protects Tor circuits, is estimated to require somewhere between 1,200 and 1,450 logical qubits, and up to hundreds of thousands, or even millions, of physical qubits once error correction is factored in. In other words, the machines that exist today are still 1 or 2 orders of magnitude away from the machines that would actually pose a threat. This is the gap that headlines love to erase. When a story tells you that quantum computers have already killed dark web anonymity, it is skipping over one of the most important facts in the entire conversation, which is that no cryptographically relevant quantum computer currently exists. That phrase, cryptographically relevant quantum computer, is not a slogan invented by skeptics. It appears directly inside the research papers being published by the very people building this hardware. Even in aggressive, optimistic projections published in 2026, researchers explicitly state that a quantum computer capable of breaking modern cryptographic standards does not exist as of today. So if you saw a headline claiming Tor has already been cracked, claiming the dark web has already been exposed, that headline was not describing reality. It was describing fear, dressed up as fact. But here's where the story gets more complicated and honestly more interesting than the exaggerated version. Even though no quantum computer can break Tor today, that does not mean today's anonymity is guaranteed to remain safe forever. And it does not mean the threat is purely hypothetical either. There's a strategy that intelligence agencies, cybercriminals, and state-sponsored hackers have almost certainly already been using for years. It's called Harvest now, Decrypt Later. The idea is simple, and it's exactly as unsettling as it sounds. An adversary doesn't need a quantum computer today to benefit from one in the future. All they need to do is capture and store encrypted traffic now, traffic they cannot currently read, and simply wait. Wait for the day when quantum computers become powerful enough to retroactively decrypt everything they've been quietly archiving. Encrypted files, encrypted messages, encrypted dark web sessions, all of it sitting in cold storage somewhere, useless today, but potentially fully readable a decade from now. Think about what that means for anyone who has ever assumed anonymity online is permanent. A message sent through Tor today might feel completely untraceable in this exact moment. But if that traffic was intercepted and archived by an adversary with the patience and resources to wait, its anonymity has an expiration date. Nobody knows exactly when that date arrives. It could be 5 years away. It could be 15. But the mere existence of this strategy changes the entire calculation around anonymous communication. It's no longer just about whether your traffic can be traced today. It's about whether it can be traced ever at any point in the future by anyone patient enough to hold on to it. This is why the threat to dark web anonymity is real, even if the sensational headlines get the timeline wrong. The danger isn't that quantum computers have already broken Tor. The danger is that quantum computers might eventually break the encrypted archive of everything Tor has ever carried. For journalists protecting sources from decades ago, for activists who spoke out against regimes that are still in power, for whistleblowers whose identities were supposed to stay hidden forever, Harvest Now, Decrypt Later, isn't some abstract academic concern. It's a slow-motion threat aimed directly at the promises those systems made to the people who trusted them. Now let's talk about what's actually happening to fix this, because the story doesn't end with a warning. It continues with a response, and that response has been underway for years, quietly, in research labs and cryptography conferences most people never hear about. The Tor Project itself has been aware of this threat for a long time. There's a formal design proposal, cataloged as Proposal 269, describing what's called a transitionally secure hybrid handshake. In plain language, this means Tor's connection process is being redesigned to combine classical cryptographic methods with newer, quantum-resistant methods, so that even if one system eventually falls to a quantum attack, the other layer of protection remains intact. It's not a total overhaul overnight. It's a gradual, deliberate transition, layering new protections on top of old ones, so the system doesn't become suddenly and catastrophically vulnerable the moment quantum computers cross some invisible threshold. Beyond Tor's own internal proposals, academic researchers have been exploring entirely new architectures for anonymous communication that assume a quantum-powered adversary from the very beginning. One approach, sometimes described as onion-routed multi-circuit key establishment, works by splitting a single session key into multiple independent fragments. Instead of relying on one cryptographic exchange that a quantum computer could theoretically crack, the system spreads pieces of the key across several separate temporary paths through the Tor network. To reconstruct the original key, an attacker wouldn't just need to break one circuit. They would need to simultaneously compromise multiple independent circuits, each one requiring its own separate breach. As more fragments are added, the difficulty for an attacker increases substantially because the number of circuits that need to be broken scales with the number of key pieces being used. It's a defense built not around a single unbreakable wall, but around forcing an attacker to break through many walls at once, in parallel, before the pieces can even be assembled. There's also serious research into something called quantum key distribution, or QKD, which flips the entire premise of the threat on its head. Instead of trying to build encryption that's merely hard for a quantum computer to break, QKD uses the physical properties of quantum mechanics itself to secure the exchange of keys. In a properly implemented quantum key distribution system, any attempt to intercept or eavesdrop on the key exchange actually disturbs the quantum state being transmitted, which means the interception itself can be detected. Researchers have proposed redesigning parts of Tor's key exchange process to incorporate this kind of quantum secure architecture, aiming for what's called information theoretic security. That's a fancy way of saying the security wouldn't depend on how hard a math problem is to solve. It would depend on the actual laws of physics, which don't change no matter how powerful a computer becomes. Of course, none of these solutions are simple to deploy at scale. Quantum key distribution networks currently work best across smaller metropolitan-sized infrastructure, not the sprawling, globally distributed network of volunteer-run relays that makes up Tor today. Scaling these systems up to protect millions of users spread across the entire planet remains a major unsolved engineering challenge. And the multi-circuit key fragmentation approach, while promising, still requires optimizing how quickly Tor can establish and coordinate multiple circuits simultaneously, since added security often comes with added complexity and slower connection times. These aren't finished solutions sitting on a shelf, ready to deploy tomorrow. They're active areas of research, being tested, refined, and debated inside the cryptography community right now, in real time, while the underlying quantum hardware continues to advance in the background. So where does that leave the actual threat level today, in this exact moment? Here's a number worth sitting with. According to widely cited estimates, even a large hypothetical quantum computer attacking Tor's layered encryption would only be able to unlock roughly one layer of that encryption every 8 hours, on average. Tor's entire design relies on wrapping traffic in multiple nested layers, much like the layers of an onion, which is where the name comes from. Cracking through even one of those layers using a quantum computer that doesn't currently exist at the required scale would still take hours. To trace a single anonymous session from start to finish, an attacker would need to break through several of these layers in sequence, all while working from previously recorded traffic, since real-time interception and decryption at that speed remains far beyond anything currently possible. This isn't the picture of instant, effortless de-anonymization that dramatic headlines suggest. It's a slow, resource-intensive process that currently exists only in theoretical projections, not operational reality. None of this should be mistaken for a reason to relax. The trajectory here matters more than the current snapshot. Just a few years ago, experts surveyed by organizations studying quantum risk estimated that a quantum computer capable of breaking common encryption standards within 24 hours was unlikely to exist within 10 years, and only partially likely within 15. The real threat horizon, according to that same survey, was estimated to begin only after 20 years. But estimates like that have been shrinking, not growing, with each passing year. The number of physical qubits required to break elliptic curve cryptography has fallen dramatically since earlier projections made less than a decade ago, thanks to smarter algorithms rather than simply bigger hardware. Combine that trend with the sudden acceleration reported by Google and its research partners in early 2026, and you get a very different emotional temperature inside the research community than the calm confidence of just a few years earlier. Nobody serious is claiming the sky is falling today, but plenty of serious people are saying the sky might fall sooner than we previously assumed, and that changes how urgently the fixes need to be built. It's worth pausing here to separate two very different kinds of anonymity that often get lumped together under the umbrella of the dark web. There's anonymity of communication, meaning the ability to send and receive messages, browse websites, and route traffic without revealing your identity or location. And there's anonymity of transaction, which largely depends on cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin and Ethereum. Both systems rely on similar underlying cryptographic principles, and both face similar theoretical quantum threats. If quantum computers eventually become powerful enough to break the elliptic curve. Cryptography, securing Bitcoin wallets, the financial infrastructure that underpins much of the dark web's economy, could become exposed right alongside the communication anonymity that Tor provides. This means the quantum threat to the dark web isn't just a privacy story. It's potentially an economic one too, striking at the very currency systems that make anonymous transactions possible in the first place. This dual vulnerability, communication and currency, is part of why researchers aren't treating this as a distant, abstract problem confined to physics departments. It's why cybersecurity teams at major companies, including the ones responsible for securing enormous portions of internet traffic, have started openly discussing post-quantum migration timelines in urgent terms rather than casual, someday we'll get to it terms. It's why intelligence agencies around the world are almost certainly already engaged in exactly the kind of harvest now, Decrypt Later data collection described earlier, quietly building archives of encrypted traffic they cannot read today, betting that patience will eventually pay off. And it's why the engineers behind Tor itself are not waiting for a fully mature quantum computer to show up before making changes. They're building in protections now, while there's still time to do it carefully, rather than scrambling to patch a system after it's already been compromised. For everyday users of anonymous networks, the picture that emerges from all of this is neither the terrifying instant collapse that clickbait headlines describe, nor the total non-issue that skeptics sometimes dismiss it as. It's something in between, and honestly, something more useful to understand than either extreme. Dark web anonymity has not been killed. Tor has not been broken. Nobody is reading your anonymous traffic in real time using a quantum computer, because that machine simply does not exist yet, not by a significant margin. But the foundation underneath that anonymity is aging faster than most people realize, and the math that has protected it for over 2 decades has a known, publicly documented expiration date, even if nobody can say exactly which calendar year that expiration falls on. What makes this story worth paying attention to isn't a dramatic headline about a single moment when everything changed. It's the slow, steady convergence of 2 timelines running in parallel. One timeline is quantum computing hardware, advancing faster than almost anyone predicted just a few years ago, chipping away qubit by qubit, algorithm improvement by algorithm improvement, at the wall that's supposed to be impossible to climb. The other timeline is the defensive response. Proposals like Tor's hybrid handshake, research into fragmented multi-circuit key exchange, experiments with quantum key distribution, all racing to reinforce that wall before the first timeline catches up to it. Right now, the defenders appear to be ahead. The math protecting Tor today, while theoretically vulnerable in the long run, remains practically unbreakable by any machine currently in existence. But the margin between those 2 timelines has been shrinking, not expanding, and that shrinking margin is the real story here. Not a headline claiming anonymity is already dead, but a quieter, more accurate warning that the foundation it stands on is being tested by a threat that used to feel like science fiction and now feels like an engineering deadline. It's also worth understanding why this particular threat feels so different from the ordinary cybersecurity warnings people have grown numb to over the years. Most security stories follow a familiar pattern. A vulnerability is discovered. A patch is released. Users update their software and the danger passes within days or weeks. The quantum threat to anonymity doesn't follow that pattern at all. There's no single patch that fixes it, because the vulnerability isn't a bug in the code. It's a mathematical property of the encryption itself, baked into the very algorithms that made secure communication possible in the first place. You can't patch away the fact that factoring large numbers eventually becomes easy for the right kind of machine. You can only replace the underlying math with something new, something built to resist that specific kind of attack, and that kind of replacement takes years, sometimes decades, to roll out safely across an entire distributed network like Tor, made up of thousands of independently operated relays run by volunteers all over the world. That distributed volunteer-driven structure is actually part of what makes this transition so complicated. Tor isn't a single company that can push out one update and instantly protect every user. It's a sprawling, decentralized network where the software running each relay, each bridge, and each client needs to be updated, tested, and synchronized across an enormous and largely uncoordinated population of operators. Some relays are run by universities, some are run by nonprofits, some are run by individual volunteers donating spare bandwidth from a home computer somewhere. Coordinating a cryptographic migration across a network like that isn't just a technical challenge, it's a logistical one, and it's part of why proposals like the hybrid handshake are designed to be gradual and backward compatible, rather than an abrupt, everything changes at once switch that could break the network or leave older clients unable to connect at all. There's another angle to this story that rarely makes it into the sensational headlines, and it has to do with who actually benefits from getting the timeline wrong. Overstating the threat, claiming anonymity has already collapsed, tends to serve 2 very different audiences for 2 very different reasons. For fear-driven media, it drives clicks, because nothing spreads faster than a headline suggesting some invisible danger has already arrived without anyone noticing. For certain law enforcement and intelligence narratives, exaggerating the collapse of anonymity can serve as a kind of psychological deterrent, making people using these networks for both legitimate and illegitimate purposes believe they've already been caught, even when the technical reality doesn't support that claim. Understanding the real timeline matters, not just for accuracy's sake, but because it directly affects the decisions real people make. Journalists deciding whether a source's identity is still protected. Activists deciding whether historical communications are still safe. Ordinary people deciding how much trust to place in the tools they rely on for privacy. Getting the story wrong in either direction, either dismissing the threat entirely or wildly overstating it, leads people toward bad decisions. The most honest way to think about where things stand today is to picture two clocks running side by side, both largely invisible to the public. One clock is counting down toward the eventual arrival of a cryptographically relevant quantum computer, a machine powerful enough to make good on decades of theoretical warnings. Nobody knows exactly what time that clock reads right now, and estimates have been revised downward, meaning sooner, more than once, in just the past few years. The other clock is counting down toward the completion of a global transition to post-quantum and quantum-resistant cryptography, a slow, deliberate, worldwide engineering effort spanning everything from banking systems to anonymous browsing networks like Tor. As long as the second clock finishes before the first one does, the transition happens quietly, successfully, and mostly invisibly to ordinary users, the same way countless previous cryptographic upgrades have happened in the past without anyone outside the security community ever noticing. The real danger isn't that quantum computers exist today, it's the possibility that the first clock quietly overtakes the second, and by the time that becomes obvious to the public, it's already too late for the traffic that was archived years earlier, under the assumption that it was permanently unreadable. So the next time you see a headline claiming quantum computers have already killed dark web anonymity, you'll know what's actually true and what isn't. No cryptographically relevant quantum computer exists today. Tor has not been broken. The dark web has not been exposed by some sudden quantum breakthrough. But underneath that reassurance sits a genuine, well-documented, and actively evolving threat, one being taken seriously by researchers, by major internet infrastructure companies, and by the very engineers responsible for maintaining Tor itself. Harvest. Now, Decrypt Later isn't a hypothetical strategy dreamed up to scare people. It's a documented, plausible approach that patient, well-resourced adversaries have every incentive to already be using, quietly archiving what they cannot yet read, waiting for the math to eventually catch up to the moment. And whether that moment arrives in 5 years, 15 years, or sometime further down the road nobody can fully predict yet, the systems protecting anonymity today are being rebuilt right now, layer by layer, circuit by circuit, before that clock finishes ticking down to zero. What should stay with you after all of this isn't a date to circle on a calendar, because nobody honestly has one. It's a shift in how you think about the word permanent. For years, anonymity online was treated as something binary. Either you were traceable or you weren't. Either a system was secure or it had failed. Quantum computing complicates that binary completely. It introduces a third state, traffic that is secure today but potentially exposed tomorrow, protected in this moment but silently vulnerable across time. That's a strange, unfamiliar way to think about privacy, and it's exactly why the story deserves more careful attention than a panic-driven headline can offer. Not because the sky is falling right now, but because the ground underneath one of the internet's oldest promises of anonymity is shifting, slowly, deliberately, and in full view of anyone paying close enough attention to notice. The machines that could someday break that promise are still being built, qubit by qubit, in labs most of us will never see, and the defenses meant to outrun them are being built in parallel, quietly, by people determined not to let that promise expire on their watch.